May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak. Please know I truly do recognize the irony that I'm now going to speak for 10 minutes about the importance of listening. In my heart of hearts, I would like to pair you up for a practical exercise in deep listening, but I know that using breakout rooms during a sermon can feel coercive to some, which would undermine the trust necessary for genuine vulnerability to emerge. So I won't do that. But I am going to invite us to visit 2 other churches for a few minutes this morning to hear some voices of people with deep experience in the art of listening. First, we'll watch an excerpt of an interview with Krista Tippett, who is the host of the popular public radio show On Being, which is usually broadcast on Sunday mornings and which has become a sort of church for many people. Krista interviews all sorts of people about meaning, purpose, and ultimately spirituality. In this case, however, it's Krista who's being interviewed, and we'll listen to some of her wisdom on the practice of generous listening. Secondly, we'll watch an excerpt from Oprah's popular TV show, Super Soul Sunday. On her show, Oprah speaks with a wide range of global spiritual luminaries, knee to knee in an incredibly intimate format. Today, we'll listen to an excerpt of her conversation with Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh on the practice of compassionate listening. In my own experience of learning to be present with people's pain and suffering and fear and despair, those who think deeply and carefully about listening have become important guides. But strangely, listening is not often talked about as a Christian spiritual practice. I believe, though, that listening is actually foundational to the development of all of our other practices, including prayer. Indeed, we cannot really love without deep listening, and we cannot serve others well without deep listening. And so as you listen today, I'll ask you to consider your own spiritual development as a listener. What kind of listener are you? And how might you need to grow as a listener in order to give the gift of presence to your family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers? Let us consider then the wisdom of 2 people who have thought so much about listening. First, we'll hear from Krista Tippett.
And so because we've kind of unlearned this thing, I think it's interesting to think about what are its really basic component parts. For me, listening brings a quality, musters a quality of generosity, and a spiritual technology is always working in 2 directions. It's inner work as much as it's outer work. So especially in this world we inhabit now, and with so many things we're fighting about, and so many things we're fearful about, this is not as easy as it sounds, right? In fact, it's not very instinctive. To me, a generous listener, a definition of that would be wanting to understand the humanity behind the words of the other. So it's not just about the words that are going to pass between us, and wanting to bring your own best words and your best ideas into the conversation. You have to muster also in yourself a real curiosity to bring that kind of generosity to bear. And again, this is really kind of a withered muscle. The thing about curiosity is you can't actually fake it. And again, whether we're online or offline, we at an animal level, when we encounter another human being, absolutely know whether they're really curious or whether they're just asking us a question. We know that in our bodies. So really, like, even just this basic component of the art of living, of being curious, becomes kind of a spiritual discipline. Or if you don't like that language, it becomes a muscle that we need to flex and flex so that it again starts to feel like instinct, starts to feel natural. Listening involves vulnerability. I mean, one litmus test about whether you have actually gotten yourself to a curious place that you can ask, whether you go into a room, whether that's a virtual room or a physical room, is, are you willing to be surprised? And again, we walk into all of our spaces these days so guarded, so clear about what we have to say, what we have to present, what we have to protect, and also so clear about what we think those other people stand for. So to be willing to be surprised is an unnatural move right now. And then the final piece of this that I want to add is that we actually have to, that actually in many of the spaces we are currently working with and living in and meeting each other in, it wouldn't actually be reasonable to ask other people to surprise themselves or surprise us. So there's a piece of this. I think that the social art of listening is intimately connected with the virtue of hospitality, another spiritual technology. One thing I love about hospitality, it's kind of a gateway to all the other great virtues, compassion or love. You actually, though, it's much easier. It's an easier entry point. You don't actually have to love someone to be hospitable towards them. You don't have to agree with them to be hospitable towards them. You don't even have to like them to be hospitable towards them. But we know in our analog lives, and I think maybe we're learning in our online lives, that the space you create absolutely limits or expands what is possible that will happen there. There is a difference between creating a space with a welcome and an ethos, or just opening the door so that anything can happen.
So let's now hear a segment from Oprah's interview with Thich Nhat Hanh. For those of you who don't know his story, let me share just a snippet from his biography. In the midst of the Vietnam War, Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh traveled to the US and Europe to make the case for peace and to call for an end to the hostilities in Vietnam. It was during his 1966 trip that he first met the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1967. As a result of this mission, however, both North and South Vietnam denied him the right to return to Vietnam, and he began a long exile of 39 years, which was mostly spent in France. Let's hear now from Thich Nhat Hanh.
You refer to, I can't remember which book, but you talk about deep listening also.
Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of the other person. We can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose, help him or her to empty his heart. And if you remember that you are helping him or her to suffer less, and then even if he say things full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable to continue to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that, with compassion, you give him or her a chance to suffer less. If you want to help him or her to correct his perception, and then you wait for another time, but for this, the time being, you just listen with compassion and help him or her to suffer less. And 1 hour like that can bring transformation and healing.
So I love this idea of deep listening, because oftentimes when someone comes to you and they want to really vent, they want to purge whatever is going on inside them, people start talking and giving advice. So if you allow the person just to let whatever those feelings are to come out, and then at another time come back to them with your advice or your comments, you would experience a deeper healing. That's what you're saying.
Yes, the fear, the anger, and the despair is born on the ground of wrong perception. And we have wrong perceptions concerning ourselves and the other person. And that is the foundation for conflict and war and violence.
You've said that the only way we can begin to end war is due to communication between people.
Yes. And we should be able to say like this, dear friends, dear people, I know that you suffer a lot. I have not understood enough of your difficulties and suffering. It's not our intention to make you suffer more. It is the opposite. So please tell us about your suffering, your difficulties. I'm eager to learn, to understand. It has to start like that, loving speech. And if we are honest, if we are true, they will open their heart and tell us. And then we practice compassionate, deep listening. And during the process of deep listening, we can learn so much about our own perception and their perceptions. And that is the best way, the only way to remove terrorism.
Terrorism or even difficulties between yourself and
Yes.
family members or friends.
Yes.
And the principle is the same no matter the conflict.
Yes.
Terrorists, anti-terrorists,
Yes.
father and son,
Right.
yourself and your boss,
Right.
yourself and your children, your best friend.
Yes.
So what do you think? Are you convinced that you might have room to grow as a listener? And are you convinced of listening's importance as a spiritual practice? If we venture a bit further into our passage today from the book of James, the letter of James, after being urged to be quick to listen and slow to speak, we arrive at an iconic verse that seems to stand at odds with James's previous admonitions. He says, "Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves." Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. When we hear this verse, I would venture that most of us hear it as a call to action. Don't just sit there, do something. Don't just come to church, bring Jesus's teachings to life. Don't fool yourself into thinking that agreeing with Jesus is enough. Take some risks, put some skin in the game, become a disciple. But today, at least for a moment, I don't want us to jump into action quite so quickly, because I think that the tendency to be doers is so automatic for many of us that we don't tend to reflect much on what we count as valid doing and on what we don't. Hands-on service to those in need definitely counts, whereas cultivating inner dispositions of holiness often doesn't rise to the same level of importance. For many of us, doing necessarily involves outward expenditures of effort that tangibly benefit other people, which means, unfortunately, that the more subtle processes of refining our inner and interpersonal lives don't always tend to measure up or receive our best efforts. And this is why I think listening isn't something to which we give a whole lot of time or attention. But I firmly believe that generous, compassionate listening is indeed a way to be doers of the word. And I believe it's time to stop shortchanging the interpersonal realm as an important place for us to experience and to practice holiness. As many of us prepare to return to in-person worship, we have an opportunity to connect with one another quite differently than we did before the pandemic. Many of you have said that we've gotten to know one another better during our time on Zoom and that we've even grown closer as a community. So how will we bring these connections with us to 36 Ardmore Avenue? How will we welcome one another back into embodied community? How will we listen to and speak with one another in ways that build up our mutual love and affection? Zoom has taken away many of the interpersonal exchanges that can make Sunday mornings so rich and full and life-giving. We can't really have personal conversations on Zoom except in the chat box or in smaller breakout rooms. But being back in person means that Sundays will become much more interpersonally rich and complex. For some of us, this will be a great joy. For others, though, perhaps because we're more introverted, or we're newer to St. Mary's, or we're going through a time of personal struggle, this may be more of a challenge. So what a marvelous time for us to become better listeners. What a marvelous time for us to reflect on the kind of space we create for one another on Sunday mornings, the kind of hospitality that we offer. What a marvelous time for us to become even more intentionally hospitable to both friend and stranger alike. God has given us one another, has given us this Christian community as a place to gain practice in the arts of listening and loving. May we dedicate ourselves to these practices with God's help and inspiration. May it be so. Amen.